Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this edition we'll be looking at the Arab Spring and the current upheaval in the Arab world and how Israel is responding to the challenge that is known as the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring started in the beginning of 2011, and since then we've seen the falls of the regimes in Tunisia and in Egypt and Libya, with mounting domestic and international pressure placed upon the Syrian regime, could see the end of Bashar al-Assad maybe within the next few months. What promised to be a new hope and a new dawn in the Middle East that was inspired by socially networking sites as thousands of young Arabs took to the streets to demand their freedom. Almost a year on, and with the implementation of parliamentary and presidential elections in those nations in the Arab world, we're seeing the rise of dangerous Islamist groups who look to benefit in these democratic elections. So we'll be asking, what are the dangers for Israel? The second part of the program would be focusing on Iran, and it was only last week that the Iranian demonstrators demonstrated outside the British embassy in Tehran, which resulted in the British government taking unusual and unprecedented action in expelling the Iranian ambassador and Iranian diplomats from the Iranian embassy here in London. So we'll be asking, what are those consequences of those actions, and has negotiations ended? And now, are we embarking on a future war with Iran? To discuss these vital and critical issues today, I'm joined once again by Alex Ryvchin, who is part of JewishThinker.org and a spokesman for the British Zionist Federation. Alex, welcome back to the Middle East Report. It's good to have you on the programme again. For some of our viewers, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and the organisations you represent?
Sure. I was born in Kiev in the Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union, to Jewish parents. My family and I migrated to Australia when I was 3.5 years old. My parents understood very early on that, given the deep-seated anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, that my brother and I would never have sort of sufficient opportunities in that country. We were taken in as refugees by Australia, where I was educated and raised, where I met my wife. And I've been involved in advocacy on behalf of the Zionist Federation and writing for the Jewish Thinker as well for a number of years, which is sort of built on my love of Israel, my belief in the Jewish state, and the sense that I have of the need to stand up for the Jewish people.
Yeah. And Alex, haven't we seen incredible things happen in 2011 with the Arab Spring? I mean, we've seen the fall of the regime in Tunisia, then followed by the fall of President Mubarak, and we've seen the demonstration, the protesters in Tahrir Square in Cairo. We've also now seen the fall of Colonel Gaddafi from Libya, and no one would have believed that was possible. And also now huge amounts of pressure being placed upon Bashar al-Assad of Syria, and it's only probably a question of time before we see the end of the Syrian regime. What do you make of the Arab Spring that is really, really shaking the entire Middle East?
I think the Arab Spring has, above all else, created a great deal of uncertainty in the region. With the dictators which have now been replaced, and as you said in the case of al-Assad, seem to be falling, for better or for worse, we knew where we stood. But now we're in a situation where we don't know what will replace these dictatorships, some of which have been in power for decades, some of which come from family lines who have been in there for centuries. And there's a great question as to whether we will see genuine, vibrant democracies take their place, or whether we will see the Islamists, the fundamentalists, which these dictators did so well to keep out of the countries, whether we see them flooding back in. I think there are great implications for Israel and foreign policy consequences, but the Arab Spring is not motivated by foreign policy or by any considerations to do with Israel. They come from a basic desire of the people for democracy, the things that you and I in this country take for granted. The rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and political association, the freedom to blog whatever your political views may be. And I think that these people have a great sense that for too long these dictators have grown rich and fat from the resource wealth of these countries, from the efforts of the people, while the people themselves have lived in abject poverty. So I think that they are very justified in seeking democracy and seeking an end to these dictatorships. But with democracy also comes a grave responsibility, and there's a responsibility on the voters to choose well. We saw in the first free Palestinian elections in 2006, the people of Gaza did not choose well. They elected a terror organization to be their face of the world. So it is incumbent on the voters in these countries to exercise their votes well, because if they choose to elect Islamists, I think they will bear consequences. They will see isolation of their countries, they will see withdrawal of foreign aid, tourism will collapse, foreign investment will collapse, and also there's a great onus on whoever is elected, whether they be Islamist or secular. There is an onus on them to be good governments, and that means ensuring the welfare and protection of minorities in these countries. For example, the Coptic Church in Egypt has seen terrible atrocities perpetrated against it. And there's also an onus on the government to ensure that peace with neighbours is maintained, and where there is no peace, that they reach out for peace. So it's created a great deal of uncertainty. And we may be optimistic as to what will happen, or perhaps pessimistic, but either way I think there's a great responsibility on both the electorate and the elected to act in a certain manner.
I mean, isn't that, I mean, Bush termed this whole concept, I mean, a lot of President Bush's foreign policy, particularly in light of the war in Iraq in 2003, was the implementation of democracy, believing that if the Arab world embraced democracy, then the chances of conflict would recede, because democracies don't go to war against other democracies. But I think one thing we've probably seen this year more than any other year is that you may institute electoral reform, you may allow the people to have the vote, but if you don't build those democratic institutions like a free press, a free parliament, freedom of expression and religious freedom, then all those are simply futile.
Yeah. A true democracy cannot emerge overnight, and as I said, these dictatorships had been in power and had been entrenched for so long, and the people living under them only knew one mode of life, one type of life, and that is living under autocracy and dictatorship. With the fall of these dictators, whilst we hope that there will be a smooth transition to a democracy, and it is true, democracies are rational actors, and they do not engage in war because it's not in the self-interest of the country. But we are very optimistic if we believe that these dictators can be swept out of power and that true vibrant democracies can take their place. There are no coherent opposition movements. The only real opposition that there has ever been to these dictatorships has been Islamist movements, which have been largely suppressed and forced underground. And there is a very, very grave concern, and we're seeing this in the results of these elections coming in from Tunisia, Morocco, the first round of elections in Egypt, this movement towards Islamists. And it's because these are really the only other alternate organizations. There are no true liberal democracies that the people have a chance to elect. So there is a very grave concern that the dictators will go, but they'll be replaced with something perhaps far worse.
Which then leads me on to my next point, Alex, which I think is very relevant. In terms of American foreign policy or British foreign policy towards the Arab world and the Arab Spring, for so long the United States would say tolerate Mubarak in Egypt, and they may turn a blind eye to many of the human rights abuses that occurred under his regime, or in Saudi Arabia or other Arab states, in order to support stability. Now, isn't there a great danger now, because of the Americans and American foreign policy in particular supporting these new movements in the Middle East, that they're a mixed cocktail? There is so much about the unknown, and by not standing up for people like Mubarak and protecting Mubarak and seeing him fall from power, could bring about something far worse, and that would be an Islamist government committed to Sharia law and effectively wanting to antagonize Israel and possibly start a war with Israel and the West.
Yeah, there is that great concern, and the West was admittedly in a very difficult position. On the one hand, it had to support these movements for democracy. And these movements for democracy, I believe, weren't fueled by a desire from the people to move towards Sharia law or Islamism or extreme forms of Islamic fundamentalism. They arose from a genuine desire for democracy and a better way of life. But in supporting that, the West has essentially destabilized the region. You had dictatorships such as that of Mubarak, which really created a very good state of affairs with Israel, a long-lasting peace to the mutual benefit of both countries. And now with the fall of Mubarak in particular, and with Gaddafi, and without a real vibrant opposition movement and a democracy to take its place, there is a very grave risk that we will go from one extreme form of government, autocracy, to another, being Sharia law.
We've got a clip to go to now, and this is a NATO clip looking at the Arab Spring and the influence of social networking sites in mobilizing so many young Arabs to protest and make a stand against tyranny under their oppressive regimes.
In Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old fruit and vegetable street vendor, set himself on fire on December the 17th, 2010. He was protesting against corrupt local police and authorities. He died on January the 4th. Protests spread following his death, both across the country and the internet. Protesters uploaded videos of unrest, whilst the authorities allegedly fought back with censorship and hacking. But by January the 14th, ex-Tunisian President Ben Ali's 23 years in power were over.
Social media played a role, but not a determinative role. The dominant medium is still television. And part of that is due to the fact that social media are not as pervasive in that part of the world as they are in the more developed nations. You look at Facebook, for example, which is used by only about 5% of the population. Internet penetration throughout the region is about 20%. So that's important, but it's television, on the other hand, reaches upwards of 80% of the population, particularly in the big cities. And so the dominant medium was television, sometimes repurposing material that it found on the social media sites.
In Egypt, a Facebook page called for a day of protest on the 25th of January 2011 over the death of a 28-year-old man named Khaled Said. Police officers had dragged him from an internet cafe and beaten him to death. More than 80,000 people signed up for the protests on the Facebook page. The protests continued in Egypt despite the mobile phone and internet network being down for several days. On February the 11th, ex-Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak's 30 years in power were over. The original Facebook page, called "We Are All Khaled Said," has nearly 1 million likes.
Social media is much broader than sending 144 characters over Twitter or updating your status posts on Facebook. Those are useful, but if you look at how people are sharing videos, how they are sharing information in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, it's primarily through SMS. It's not primarily through Twitter. We observe Twitter, so we give Twitter a lot of credit, but there's a lot more communication going underneath that obvious. The number one enemy, it seems nowadays, in every state in North Africa is Al Jazeera. Whether you're Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, they all blame Al Jazeera for everything that has gone wrong. And Al Jazeera has taken a very aggressive stance, one might say, in broadcasting events, whereas 5-10 years ago, that would have not been possible. So we see a broader dissemination of information. When Al Jazeera's signal is jammed or cut off and there's only state TV, we see people picking up the slack through mobile phones, through telephony, through voice over internet protocol, etc.
You have cases, for example, in Cairo, where there were people who came out into the streets in poor neighborhoods where they didn't even have television. But the ambiance of the city changed. It became a revolutionary city. People were shouting into entryways of apartment houses, "Come join us." It wasn't any fancy technology that was in use there.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Alex, we saw there the impact of social networking sites such as Facebook and Twitter and possibly YouTube as well, plus the influence of television in mobilizing the masses to come and protest against the regime. Do you believe that these forms of media can be used by the democratic and liberal elements within the Arab world to ensure that the Islamists don't take power and don't take hold of these countries?
I would certainly hope so. As we saw there, social media has an incredible power and incredible reach, whereas with these dictatorial regimes, any dissenting view was very quickly stifled and there was only one sort of state position. Social media enabled different perspectives from around the world to be heard. And we certainly hope that with the advent of social media in these countries, that different perspectives, perhaps an Israeli perspective on the Arab-Israeli conflict, a Western perspective, a Christian perspective, these will all be made available to the people and that they will then aid their choices in the interests of democracy. But it does really remain to be seen whether that will happen in any genuine way with the rise of Islamic fundamentalist movements in these countries to replace these dictatorships. Because whilst they lobby largely on anti-corruption lines, which are very admirable, ultimately it will be a broad Islamic agenda which takes place and which comes into effect. And one of those things will inevitably be a limiting of information. So we might be right back where we are now or before in the pre-dictatorial days, where there is one state line, state position, and that could be as hardline or even more so than that heard from the dictators.
I mean, when this all took place and we saw the fall of Mubarak's regime, the Israeli government responded probably quite naturally, very nervously, fearing that Israel's peace treaty with Egypt, which has now lasted over 32 years, could now be in threat. Now we know that the most organised group in Egypt are the Muslim Brotherhood, who are affiliated to Hamas, and Hamas in their covenant charter call for the destruction of the state of Israel and the genocide of the Jewish people. Isn't there a great danger that if the Muslim Brotherhood win the majority of parliamentary elections, they can use that as a springboard in order to win the Egyptian presidency and then align themselves with Hamas and the more extreme elements in the Middle East and declaring the peace treaty with Israel over?
Yeah, there's a very grave risk to Israel emerging from events in Egypt. Hosni Mubarak was a very important ally for Israel, largely because he retained the peace that was found by his predecessor. And since his fall, we have seen this great rise in lawlessness in Egypt. We're seeing, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula, we're seeing the rise of extremist movements. We're seeing radicalization there. We've seen the gas pipeline, which supplies both Israel and Jordan, bombed 9 times since the fall of Mubarak. We've seen an infiltration into Israel from the Sinai in a terror attack near Eilat, which left 8 Israelis dead. That would simply not have been possible under Hosni Mubarak. We also saw the storming of the Israeli embassy, which came from very, very little. You had 2 protests, one of which was to do with football hooliganism and the police response to it. Completely apolitical, completely nothing to do with Israel. But somehow these 2 movements unified and found a common enemy, that classic scapegoat of Israel and the Jews. And whilst Mubarak was very capable of suppressing that public sentiment, there is a very grave concern that the Muslim Brotherhood and also the Salafists, who have performed very well in the first round of elections and preach an even more radical form of Islam, that they will exploit this popular hatred of the Jews and of Israel. And ultimately, we're talking about democracy in action, and democracy reflects the will of the people. And the will of the people in Egypt is vehemently anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and anti-Christian. And that presents a very grave risk to Israel. There was a poll in Egypt, an opinion poll recently, which showed that 54% of Egyptians prefer a rescission of the peace treaty with Israel. Now that is astounding. There is no land in dispute between the 2 countries. They've had peace for some 30 years now, to the mutual benefit of both countries. We've seen economic cooperation, agricultural programs, scientific programs between the 2. There is no reason why anyone should wish to return to a state of war, but the majority of Egyptians have voted for that very thing. So there's a very grave risk that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists will look to, rather than suppress public opinion against Israel, will actually look to play on it. And that will definitely challenge the peace with Israel.
Yeah. I've got another clip to go to now. And this clip focuses on the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu's response to the Arab Spring. where he spoke before Congress in May of this year.
The Middle East stands at a fateful crossroads, for an epic battle is now underway between tyranny and freedom. And like all of you, I pray that the peoples of the region choose the path less traveled, the path of liberty. Israel has always embraced this path. In a region where women are stoned, gays are hanged, Christians are persecuted, Israel stands out. It is different. We have a free press, independent courts, an open economy. Courageous Arab protesters are now struggling to secure these very same rights for their peoples, for their societies. We're proud in Israel that over 1 million Arab citizens of Israel have been enjoying these rights for decades. Of the 300 million Arabs in the Middle East and North Africa, only Israel's Arab citizens enjoy real democratic rights. I want you to stop for a second and think about that. Of those 300 million Arabs, less than 0.5% are truly free, and they're all citizens of Israel. This startling fact reveals a basic truth. Israel is not what is wrong about the Middle East. Israel is what is right about the Middle East.
Welcome back to the Middle East. I think it was Israel's last war with Egypt was the 1973 Yom Kippur War, in which both sides suffered very, very badly. But Israel was denied a political victory after surrounding the Egyptian Third Army Corps led by military general Ariel Sharon, which could have brought the fall of Assad's regime in Egypt. Now looking on, that Israel's had a secure border with Jordan since the signing of the Camp David Peace Accords in 1979. Is there a danger now that Israel now has to start looking at security on a southern border, instead of also having to worry about Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian Authority, but also with Hezbollah in the northern Syria as well, that Israel's borders now are becoming more and more dangerous?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Israel was fortunate to have found a peace with Jordan and a peace with Egypt, which at least meant that on two of its borders, it could count on cooperation, strategic relationships and peace. And as I said earlier, Mubarak was extremely adept at controlling extremism with his own country, not so much out of a desire to protect Israel, but purely to secure his own autocratic rule. He viewed extremism as a challenge to that. But as a consequence, the Sinai was completely demilitarized, but also there was some state of law and order in there. Since the fall of Mubarak, as I said earlier, we've seen the gas pipelines blown up on 9 times. We've seen increasing radicalization amongst the Bedouin community there, and we've seen a very dangerous infiltration in which 8 Israelis died in a terrorist attack. So it is creating that possibility of a new front for Israel, a new area of concern, whereas previously it was a very assured border. So I think that is a new concern for Israel, and I think it's indicative of the broader sort of radicalization of the region and the fact that old dictatorships are now falling and Islamists are taking their place, and that means that no peace can be taken for granted.
And looking at, as well as one of Israel's other closest, probably closest ally in the Arab world, and that's Jordan. And ever since really 1970, with Black September, when Yasser Arafat and the PLO tried to overthrow the Hashemite kingdom, and it was the King Hussein of Jordan at the time put out an emergency call to both the United States and also to Britain, and the Americans responded to the Jordanian call saying, we're too far away, your only hope is Israel. And so they pleaded with Israel to help, as something like 40,000 tanks from Syria were massing on the Jordanian border to come to the defense of Arafat. And since then, relations with Israel and Jordan have been very, very close, and we saw that in 1995 with the signing of the historic peace agreement with Jordan. Isn't there a great danger now that the Hashemites also feeling the pressure of the Arab Spring and the radicalization and Islamization of Jordan's Palestinian population, which represents 70% of the population, that we're seeing their relationship with Israel start to turn, and they're starting to look towards the Islamists and groups like Hamas?
I think there certainly is that concern. As you said, Jordan is a majority Palestinian state. It was, of course, founded from the British Mandate for Palestine, which saw Transjordan on the east bank of the River Jordan and Israel between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea form out of Palestine. So Jordan is a majority Palestinian state, and it's always had that sort of unrest between the Hashemites and the Palestinians, which has been also precipitated by the refugee problems of Arab Palestinians fleeing the wars in 48-67 and then being taken in by Jordan, where they have been kept in refugee camps rather than being integrated and given full rights as citizens in that country. So there is that great tension there between